Under the amber glow of lantern light, the saloon at the edge of the mountain town stirred with uneasy laughter and the clatter of boots on worn wooden floors. It was one of those nights when the wind outside carried the whisper of the pines, and every man inside seemed to drink not just for warmth but to forget. The old piano creaked out a slow tune, and the air smelled of tobacco, whiskey, and rain-soaked earth. Behind the counter, the waitress moved quietly, her eyes low, her voice soft as she filled glasses and avoided the kind of stares that carried more danger than words ever could. The man sitting near the door had the kind of build that made furniture seem smaller around him. His beard was thick, his eyes a murky shade of storm gray, and his hands, though still, looked capable of breaking anything in their way. They called him the Mountain Man, though no one knew his real name. Some said he'd lived half his life in the wilderness after the war. Others swore he'd run from the law. Whatever truth there was, he carried the wilderness with him, its silence, its power, and its danger. When he looked up, the waitress froze for a heartbeat, her tray trembling slightly before she steadied it against her hip. She didn't mean to meet his eyes. She did, and something cold passed between them. He rose slowly, the wooden chair scraping across the floor. And though the piano kept playing, the room seemed to lose its rhythm. Men pretended not to notice as he followed her toward the back, through the narrow hall that led to the washrooms. Someone started to speak, but thought better of it. Out here, in this forgotten mountain town, everyone had their secrets, and no one interfered with another man's business. The rain began to fall harder, beating against the window panes like hurried footsteps. The waitress turned the corner, her breath quick, her steps faster now. She could hear him behind her, the heavy boots, the quiet determination in his stride. The old corridor smelled of damp wood and soap, the flicker of a single lamp casting long, trembling shadows along the walls. She pushed through the door to the small bathroom, heart pounding, and tried to lock it, but before the latch could catch, the door swung open. He stood there, his chest heaving, his eyes burning with something dark, hunger for control. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. The silence between them was louder than thunder. She stepped back, shaking her head, whispering for him to stop, but he only moved closer. The storm outside roared louder, and for a moment it seemed nature itself was warning him. But what neither of them knew was that another set of eyes watched from the shadows just beyond the rain. Hidden behind the tall oak near the saloon's back door stood a figure, tall and silent as the night itself. His skin glowed faintly in the lamplight that seeped through the window, his long hair slick from the rain, his chest bare except for the necklace of carved bone and turquoise resting against his heart. He was the Apache king, a man both feared and honored by his people, a spirit of the mountains who walked like a ghost among men. He had come down from the hills not for war, not for vengeance, but for something lost. Yet the sight before him, the trembling woman, the looming mountain man, the danger coiled tight in the air brought back a fire he had long buried. His hand rested lightly on the knife at his belt, his eyes fixed through the rain-streaked glass. Inside, the mountain man's voice rumbled low, harsh like gravel scraping stone. The woman's voice cracked in reply, soft and desperate. The Apache king took a slow breath, his instincts whispering of danger, of fate pulling him into the affairs of men once more. For years he had stayed hidden beyond the ridges, where the forest met the sky. He'd seen the greed of settlers, the lies of soldiers, the ruin that followed whenever his people crossed paths with the new world creeping westward. He had vowed never to interfere again. But that vow began to crack the moment he saw her face, the same woman who had once offered him water by the river when the sun burned the desert red. He remembered her kindness, how she had spoken softly, unafraid, though she did not know his name. And now, fate had led him here, to this night, where the world inside that saloon threatened to crush her spirit. The mountain man stepped closer. The light flickered as the wind outside howled through the cracks in the old wooden walls. The Apache moved silently to the door, his boots barely touching the earth. The rain masked his approach, and when he placed his hand on the handle, the metal felt hot against his palm, as if the world itself was alive with warning. Inside, the waitress's voice trembled like a broken note. She backed against the sink, clutching the edge of it so hard her knuckles turned white. "Please," she whispered, "don't do this." The man froze for a moment, his jaw tightening, his eyes wild with something he couldn't name. But before he could move again, the door burst open and the wind came with it, scattering the lamplight and sending the flames shuddering. The Apache king stood in the doorway, rain dripping from his hair, his eyes fierce and calm at once. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush the room itself. The mountain man turned, startled, his hand instinctively reaching for the knife at his belt. But something in the Apache's gaze stopped him cold. There was no anger there, only a stillness that seemed to carry the weight of the mountains themselves. The waitress sank slowly to the floor, her breath catching as if the storm outside had found its way into her chest. For a moment, the three of them stood frozen in time, the hunter, the hunted, and the watcher caught in between. The thunder rolled in the distance, echoing through the valleys, and the lamplight trembled one last time before dimming low. No one spoke. The Apache's eyes shifted from the woman to the man, then to the window where the rain streamed down like tears. Somewhere deep in the forest, a wolf howled a sound both mournful and powerful. Cutting through the night, the mountain man lowered his hand slowly, the knife slipping back into its sheath. But his pride, his rage did not fade. He glared at the stranger before him, the one who had appeared like a spirit summoned by fate. "This ain't your business," he muttered under his breath, his voice low. "Dangerous." The Apache didn't answer. He stepped closer, the distance between them closing like a tightening noose. The air between them was electric, every heartbeat a countdown to something inevitable. The waitress watched with wide eyes, unsure if she should flee or stay, knowing that any movement might ignite the storm waiting to break loose. Outside, lightning struck across the mountains, illuminating the silhouettes in that narrow room. For an instant, the Apache's face was clear, noble, strong, and haunted by memories no one else could see. The mountain man's hand twitched near his knife again, and the Apache's muscles tinned. Then came the sound of a horse neighing in the distance, followed by shouts from the saloon. Someone had seen the Apache through the window. Someone had recognized what he was, and that meant danger for them all. The mountain man's expression shifted from anger to calculation. The waitress gasped, realizing the peril had only deepened. The Apache glanced toward the door, his instincts screaming that he had lingered too long. But his eyes returned to her, softening, just for a heartbeat, as if remembering the river, the sunlight and her quiet kindness, and in that heartbeat, everything began to unravel. The door to the saloon slammed open, voices rising, footsteps pounding. The night that began with rain and whiskey was about to end in blood and revelation. But for now, the only sound was the wind howling through the cracks, whispering of a destiny that none of them could escape. The storm outside showed no sign of ending, as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath for what was to come. Inside the saloon, the laughter and noise had faded to uneasy murmurs. The few men who dared to look toward the back hallway exchanged nervous glances, whispering about the stranger who'd appeared out of nowhere. Some said they saw the mark of the Apache king carved into his necklace. Others swore he had the eyes of a spirit. Whatever the truth was, they knew one thing: the night had changed the moment he stepped through that door. The mountain man stood stiff, his jaw set, eyes fixed on the tall figure before him. The Apache's presence carried a quiet authority that needed no words. Every movement, every breath he took was controlled, precise, like a wolf watching the forest for danger. The waitress, still trembling near the wall, tried to gather herself, her hands clutching the fabric of her apron. The flickering lamplight revealed her pale face, streaked with rain and fear. But her eyes, those soft brown eyes, were still alive, full of questions and something that felt like recognition. The Apache's gaze lingered on her for a moment before shifting back to the man. "You should leave," he said quietly, his voice steady but edged with warning. It wasn't a threat. It was a chance. But the mountain man wasn't the kind to take orders, especially not from someone he didn't understand. His pride was heavier than his judgment. "She's mine to deal with," he growled, stepping forward. You best turn around and walk back into whatever cave you crawled out of." The Apache didn't move. His face remained calm, unreadable. The silence stretched between them until the sound of the rain was all that filled the space. The waitress swallowed hard, her heart pounding so loud she was sure they could hear it. She didn't want to fight, but she knew it was coming. And deep down, a part of her feared it wouldn't end quickly. Then came the sound of boots, others moving closer. Drawn by the commotion, the Apache turned his head slightly, listening. He knew what those sounds meant. This town was no friend to his kind. He had seen the looks, heard the talk. To most of these settlers, his people were ghosts to be feared or hunted. Nothing more. He took a step back, his hand lowering from his knife. "This isn't your fight," he said, his eyes flicking to the woman once more, before moving toward the open door. But before he could leave, the mountain man's hand shot out, grabbing his arm. "Not so fast," he snarled. "You don't come into my place and walk away like that." The Apache's gaze darkened. His muscles tensed, though he stayed silent. For a brief second, the world seemed to hold still. The waitress found her voice, faint but desperate. "Please, stop." He didn't do anything. Her words cut through the tension, but they only seemed to anger the mountain man more. "You keep quiet," he snapped, but she didn't. She stepped between them, trembling but determined. "If you touch him, they'll come for both of you. You don't know what's coming." Outside, the voices grew louder. Men were gathering. The Apache heard their boots slapping against the mud, the metallic click of rifles being readied. His instincts told him to run, to disappear into the night like he had so many times before. But his eyes met hers again, and something stopped him. She was more than just a frightened woman in a dusty saloon. He remembered her by the river months ago, the same river where he'd found an injured horse, where she had appeared with a canteen and a gentle smile. She didn't know who he was then, only that he was a man in pain. She had knelt beside him, her hand trembling as she offered water. He had never forgotten that now, in this dimly lit room. The same woman stood before him again, risking herself to protect him. The memory stirred something deep inside him, something he thought the world had. It's burned out long ago. The mountain man's grip tightened. "You think you can just walk in here and make me look like a fool?" he said, his voice shaking with pride and anger. "You don't belong here. None of your kind do." Before the Apache could respond, a gunshot cracked through the air. The sound split the silence like lightning, echoing off the walls. The lamp shattered, plunging the room into half-darkness. The waitress screamed, ducking to the floor as splinters flew. The Apache turned swiftly, pulling her down and covering her with his arm. Through the smoke, he saw men crowding at the end of the hall, guns raised. Faces hard. "Out of the way," one of them shouted. "We'll handle him." The mountain man stepped aside, his expression full of bitter satisfaction. The Apache slowly rose, eyes glinting in the dim light. He didn't reach for his weapon, though he could have. Instead, he took a small step forward, his voice calm and steady. "I came for no fight." One of the men laughed harshly. "Then you should have stayed in the desert, savage." The word hung in the air like poison. The Apache's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He turned toward the woman, who looked up at him, terrified. "Go," he whispered. "Hide." She hesitated, tears in her eyes. "What about you?" He gave her a faint, knowing look, the kind that said he had faced worse than this. "I'll find you." She wanted to believe him, but before she could move, the men fired again. The bullet hit the doorframe beside him, splintering wood. The Apache moved fast, shoving her toward the narrow passage behind the washroom. "Go," he said again, this time with urgency. She stumbled through, heart racing. As chaos broke loose behind her, the Apache turned back, his movements fluid and sharp. He didn't strike too killingly to survive. The storm outside grew louder, thunder mixing with the clash of fists and the roar of gunfire. The saloon shook with noise, but no one inside could tell where the fight would end. Meanwhile, the woman ran into the rain-soaked alley behind the saloon. The air was cold, heavy with smoke and fear. She pressed against the wall, listening to the shouts inside. The mountain town that had once felt small and predictable now seemed alive with danger. She looked toward the dark tree line beyond the stables, and a strange instinct told her to go there. Something in her heart whispered that safety lay not with the men she'd served whiskey to for years, but with the stranger who'd risked his life for her. Inside, the Apache moved like a shadow. The mountain man had joined the others now, swinging a bottle that shattered against the wall. The Apache blocked, ducked, and pushed forward, his movements swift but measured. He didn't want blood, but the storm demanded it. Every blow he took seemed to awaken a part of him he had long buried: the warrior, the protector, the man who once fought for his people before the world tried to erase them. When he finally broke through the back door, the rain hit his skin like cold steel. The mountain man stumbled after him, cursing under his breath. The Apache looked toward the forest where the woman had gone, but before he could follow, the sound of hooves echoed through the mud. More men were coming. He turned back once, meeting the mountain man's glare through the rain. "This land doesn't belong to you," he said quietly, "and neither does she." Then he disappeared into the dark. The mountain man stood there, chest heaving, his anger turning into confusion. Something about the Apache's words lingered in his mind, unsettling him more than the fight itself. For a man who had built his life on fear and control, that feeling was worse than defeat. In the forest, the waitress stumbled through the wet grass, her breath fogging in the cold air. Every shadow looked alive, every branch seemed to reach for her. Yet when she heard the soft rhythm of footsteps behind her, not threatening, but steady, she stopped and turned. Through the mist, the Apache appeared, his face marked with rain and blood, his expression calm. For a long moment, neither spoke. The storm softened around them, as if the world itself was listening. Finally, she whispered, "Why did you follow me?" He looked at her, his voice low. "Because I was meant to." The words made her heart tighten, though she didn't understand them fully. She only knew that something in his tone felt true. Like an old story carried by the wind, far behind them the shouts of the men grew faint. The saloon lights flickered in the distance, swallowed by the storm. The town slept uneasy, unaware that its fate had just shifted. The mountain man's pride had been wounded, the Apache's past had returned, and the woman's life had crossed a path she could never turn from. And though the rain still fell, something deeper was stirring in those mountains, a reckoning between the old world and the new, between men and spirits, love and vengeance. The night wasn't done with them yet. The forest swallowed them whole as the night deepened, the path vanishing beneath the fog that rolled down from the high ridges. The waitress stumbled over roots and stones, her breath ragged, her dress clinging to her from the rain. The Apache walked a few steps behind her, silent as shadow, his sharp eyes scanning every sound.
Ow.
Every rustle of wind through the trees. It was the kind of silence that carried memory a quiet, haunted by what had already been lost. When they finally stopped near a clearing, she sank to her knees, exhausted. He said nothing for a while, only moved closer to the dying campfire left by travelers days ago. With practiced motion, he struck flint and brought back the flame, its warmth pushing away the chill of the rain. The firelight flickered across his face, carving sharp lines into his features. For the first time since she'd met him, she saw something beyond strength, or something wounded, almost human. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice small against the vast night. He looked at her, then at the flames. "You shouldn't thank me," he said quietly. "You brought danger upon yourself by staying." She shook her head, trying to make sense of it all. "You didn't have to help me. Those men would have killed you if you hadn't run." He didn't answer right away. The rain eased, replaced by the soft dripping of water from the trees. When he finally spoke, his words were heavy with the weight of years. "I've been hunted before. Men like that don't scare me." She studied him carefully. The necklace of turquoise around his neck glowed faintly in the firelight. The symbol of his people, a reminder of a world most settlers only whispered about. "You're the one they call the Apache King, aren't you?" He didn't look surprised, she knew. "That name means nothing now," he said. "A king with no tribe is just another ghost wandering the land." She wanted to ask what happened, but the sadness in his voice told her enough. The war between his people and the soldiers had left more than burned villages, it had left wounds no one could see. Yet, there was something defiant in him still, quiet strength that refused to die. In town, meanwhile, the mountain man paced the saloon floor. The gunmen who had chased the Apache into the forest returned wet and empty-handed, their tempers rising. He vanished, one spat. Like smoke. The mountain man's jaw tightened. Then find him. I want that savage dragged back here before sunrise. The barkeep leaned against the counter, uneasy. You're stirring trouble with the tribes if you do that. He wasn't the one causing harm. But the mountain man's pride was too bruised for reason. He came into my place, stood in my way. I'll teach him what happens to those who forget where they stand. Outside, lightning flashed again, lighting up the narrow valley. Farther down the road, a rider galloped fast, an older man wrapped in a weathered coat, his horse foaming at the mouth. He dismounted in front of the saloon, his face marked with worry. What in God's name happened here? He demanded. The barkeep recognized him at once, the local marshal. You came late, Sheriff, he said grimly. There was a fight. Stranger in town, one of them Apache folk. The marshal frowned. And you let a mob go after him? In this weather? He turned to the mountain man. You just made this whole town a target fool. If that man's who I think he is, the hills will burn before dawn. Back in the forest, the Apache stirred, his senses on edge. The woman noticed the change in his face even before she heard the distant echoes of horses. They're coming, he said simply. She rose to her feet, her heart racing. Then we need to hide, he shook his head. There's no hiding from men who hunt for pride. But there are places they won't follow. She didn't understand what he meant until he led her through a narrow trail that twisted into the rocks. The forest grew denser, the air thicker. They reached a small canyon where the wind made soft music between the stones. This is sacred ground, he said. Even their greed won't chase them here. The woman looked around. The air felt different, still and heavy, as if time itself paused here. How do you know they won't come? He glanced up toward the ridges, his voice softer now. Because they fear what they don't understand. For a moment, the firelight flickering from their small camp painted the canyon walls with dancing shadows. The woman sat close to him, shivering less from the cold and more from the strange calm that had fallen over her. Why did you really come down from the mountains? She asked. His eyes met hers, quiet but unreadable. There are things that can't stay buried. The soldiers took something from my people, something that doesn't belong to them. I came to take it back. She waited for him to go on, but he didn't. Instead, he reached into the small leather pouch at his belt and pulled out a small pendant half of a carved stone. Broken, clean down the middle. This is what's left of my father's mark, he said. The other half was taken by the man who led the raids against us. I tracked it to this valley. She stared at the piece, realizing it wasn't just an object. It was history, memory, and pain, all in one. You think someone here has it? He nodded slowly. The one they call the Mountain Man. He wears it on a chain like a trophy. The air between them tightened. Now she understood why fate had brought these men together, why the moment in the saloon felt like more than coincidence. The same man who frightened her carried the past of another. What happens if you take it back? She asked softly. He looked toward the flames. Then I can leave this land, knowing something of my people still lives. Far below the mountain, the marshal gathered the townsfolk, his voice cutting through the noise. No one leaves the ridge tonight. You go hunting that Apache, and you'll have war on your hands. But fear and pride made poor listeners. The mountain man saddled his horse anyway, the chain around his neck glinting faintly as he rode into the storm. He told himself it was about respect, about control. But deep down, something else burned. I need to prove that nothing could shake the hold he had over this town. The wind howled through the canyons as the Apache and the woman huddled near the fire. She turned to him suddenly. If he has what you're looking for, then he won't stop until he finds you. He nodded. Then let him come. There was no anger in his tone, only certainty. Still, she couldn't understand how a man so calm could carry so much rage inside him. When she closed her eyes, she could almost feel it, the quiet sorrow of the land, the echoes of voices long gone. The fire cracked softly, and the sound of distant thunder rolled like drums through the hills. Somewhere an owl called. The Apache rose, his silhouette tall and still against the light. "They'll find this place by dawn," he said. "We'll move before that." She stood, brushing the rain from her face. "Where will we go?" "Up," he said, "to where the earth touches the sky. There's a cave that once sheltered my people. You'll be safe there." As they climbed the narrow path, the valley below flickered with lanterns. The hunters were already coming. The Apache's steps were steady, but his thoughts ran deep about the broken stone, the war that had shattered his tribe, the woman beside him whose courage reminded him that not all hearts among the settlers were poisoned by hate by the time they reached the ridge. Dawn was just beginning to touch the sky with pale silver. The forest below still burned with torches and voices. The mountain man rode through the mist, his jaw set, his eyes fixed ahead. He didn't know that the chain around his neck carried more than stone. It carried a curse of the past waiting to awaken. High above, the Apache paused, looking down from the cliffs. The woman beside him followed his gaze, fear mixing with awe. "They're not stopping," she whispered. He nodded. "Then neither will I." The wind carried his words across the valley, into the forest where ghosts still walked, and the mountain echoed with a promise yet to be fulfilled. The storm had not ended. It had only begun. The morning came slow and gray, with clouds hanging low over the mountains. The air was sharp, carrying the smell of wet pine and smoke from the town below. The Apache stood on the ridge, silent, watching the valley where men moved like ants, searching, shouting, driven by pride and fear. Beside him, the woman wrapped her arms around herself, shivering in the cold wind. She could see the flicker of torches even from here, tiny sparks crawling up the slopes. They were coming. He turned to her, his eyes calm but burning with a strange resolve. "They will not stop now," he said. "He has called them with his pride. When a man like that feels small, he makes others bleed to feel large again." She nodded slowly, understanding more than she wanted to. "He won't rest until he finds you," she said softly. "And if he finds us, he'll kill you." The Apache looked down at his hands. "Death is not new to me, but there are things worse than dying." He reached into the leather pouch at his side and took out the half of the broken pendant. "He carries the other piece. When they are together again, a debt will end." She watched the firelight glint off the worn stone and felt the weight of the promise, the grief of 1,000 unspoken stories. "Why does he have it?" she asked. "Why would he take something like that?" The Apache's gaze turned toward the horizon, far away and full of ghosts. "Because long ago, his people came to the valley and took everything from mine. They called it conquest, but it was hunger. They burned our homes. They buried our names. The man who led them wore this piece around his neck like a victory. The one you call Mountain Man was his blood." The woman's breath caught. It wasn't just hatred that bound these men, it was inheritance. Generations of wrongs carried in silence, now ready to explode. The Apache looked at her. "You saw what he is. He believes the land and all on it belong to him. But this mountain does not forget. It remembers everything. Every scream, every fire." The wind grew louder, carrying distant gunshots. The woman flinched. "They're closer," he nodded. "Then it begins." He started toward the narrow path leading down from the ridge, his steps deliberate and soundless. The woman followed, though fear clawed at her chest. "What are you going to do?" She whispered. "I will face him," he said simply. "The mountain has waited too long for this." Down in the valley, the mountain man rode at the head of the search party. His beard was wet, his coat torn from the brush, but his eyes burned with purpose. Around his neck, the half pendant glimmered against his skin. Every time it caught the light, it seemed to pulse faintly, though he didn't notice. The men behind him muttered to one another, uneasy about following so far into the Apache's land. The sheriff had tried to stop them, but the mountain man's pride and temper carried more weight than reason. When they reached the tree line, one of the men pointed to a trail of prints. "They went this way," he said. The mountain man dismounted, crouching low to inspect the tracks. He could tell the smaller set belonged to her. The thought made his stomach twist, though he couldn't tell if it was anger or guilt. He didn't understand why she had chosen to run with that stranger. He told himself it was fear, but a darker voice whispered that maybe it was something else. "Keep moving," he ordered, tightening his grip on his rifle. "We finish this before nightfall." The forest grew thicker as they climbed, the light fading beneath the canopy. The air grew cold enough to bite, and the silence pressed heavy on their chests. Somewhere far above, thunder rumbled, and the horses grew restless. The woman and the Apache moved quickly through the winding paths. He knew these trails like veins in his own hands. Every turn, every stone carried memory. When they reached a high plateau overlooking the valley, he stopped. The land below stretched endlessly, wrapped in mist. "This is where my people made their last stand," he said quietly. "My father died here. The soldiers burned everything. The ground still remembers the fire." The woman looked around. The earth did feel different. Here older, sacred, heavy with silence. "Why bring me here?" she asked. He looked at her with a steady gaze. "Because this is where it must end. A man cannot run from his past. Nor can I." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "You don't have to face him alone." He almost smiled. "You've already done enough. You gave kindness where others gave hate. That is more than I expected from anyone." Before she could speak, a gunshot echoed in the distance, sharper this time. Birds burst from the trees, scattering across the gray sky. The Apache's hand went to his knife. "They've found the trail." The woman turned toward the sound. "Can we still run?" He shook his head. "No. If we run, they will follow us forever. If I stay, the mountain may rest." She wanted to protest, but something in his voice stopped her. He wasn't afraid, not of pain, not of death. There was peace in his decision, though it terrified her. The hours stretched thin as the day dimmed into dusk. The storm clouds gathered again, rolling low over the peaks. Lightning flashed, lighting the valley for an instant, and in that light, they saw movement below men, on horseback, climbing, searching. The Apache stood tall, his figure framed against the fading light. The woman felt her throat tighten. "He's coming," she said softly. "I know," he replied. "The mountain calls him too." Below, the mountain man led the last stretch on foot, his boots sinking into the wet soil. His breath came heavy, his anger boiling over into obsession. Each step was harder, but he refused to stop. The others hesitated, their courage waning as the air grew colder. "We shouldn't be here," one muttered. "This place ain't right." "Go back then," the mountain man snarled. "This is between me and him." He walked on alone, the sound of thunder rolling above him like war drums. The forest opened into the plateau just as the first drops of rain began to fall. And there, standing by the cliff's edge, was the Apache. The two men faced each other in the open storm. The wind whipped around them, carrying the scent of rain and smoke. The Apache said nothing at first. He only looked at the man before him, the same eyes, the same pride. The same fire that had once burned his people's homes to ash. The mountain man raised his rifle but didn't fire. Something about the stillness of the other man made his hand hesitate. "You've got something that belongs to me," he growled. The Apache's gaze fell to the chain around his neck. "No," he said quietly. "You carry what belongs to me." The mountain man's hand tightened. It's just a trinket. My father took it fair. There was nothing fair about what he took," the Apache said. "He stole the lives of my people, and he passed his greed to you." Lightning struck nearby, shaking the ground. The woman flinched but stayed hidden behind the rocks, her heart racing. She wanted to scream for them to stop, but her voice caught in her throat. The mountain man stepped forward. "You think you're some kind of hero? You think this land still belongs to you?" "Those days are gone." The Apache's voice dropped low, steady as stone. "The land doesn't belong to anyone. It remembers, it waits, and it will decide who stays." For a long moment, neither moved. The wind screamed between them, and rain began to fall harder, washing away the blood and dirt from the past day's fight. The mountain man lifted his rifle again, finger trembling on the trigger. The Apache didn't flinch. From her hiding place, the woman saw the faint glimmer of the two halves of the pendant one around each man's neck. When the lightning flashed, it was as if they were drawn to each other. Glowing faintly in the storm, the mountain man hesitated again, confusion flashing across his face. The pendant on his chest pulsed faintly as if alive. For the first time, doubt crept into his eyes. "What are you?" he whispered. The Apache took one step closer. "The past you can't bury." The wind rose to a howl. The mountain trembled beneath their feet. The woman could barely breathe as she watched them, both standing at the edge of something that felt bigger than revenge, something ancient. The mountain man raised his weapon once more, his hand shaking between fear and fury. The Apache reached for the pendant around his own neck, holding it out like an offering. The lightning split the sky, the two halves of the stone glowing brighter now, the sound of thunder swallowing their voices. And in that blinding moment, when the storm and their fates collide, everything hung suspended. The woman's heart pounded. Her breath caught in her throat. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew whatever came after this night would change everything forever. The storm broke open above them with a sound like the sky itself had split. Rain fell in sheets, soaking the earth, the trees, the rocks, everything except the stillness between the two men standing at the edge of the cliff. The mountain man's rifle trembled in his grip, his finger frozen on the trigger, while the Apache stood motionless, the half pendant in his palm glowing faintly through the storm. The two halves, one hanging on the chain. One in his hand seemed to pull toward each other, like something old and unfinished was finally demanding to be whole again. The woman watched from behind the rocks, her breath coming in sharp, shallow bursts. She didn't know whether to pray or to scream. The lightning lit the sky, and for one heartbeat she saw both men's faces clearly. The mountain man's eyes weren't cruel now. They were lost. The Apache's eyes were calm, full of sorrow more than anger. It was as if the mountain itself had forced them to see each other not as enemies, but as reflections of the same pain. Then, without warning, the rifle fired. The echo rolled through the valley, bouncing off the cliffs. The woman gasped and stumbled forward, but neither man fell. The bullet had struck the pendant hanging between them, shattering it into sparks that scattered through the rain like fireflies. Both men stood stunned, the force of the shot knocking the Apache back a step. The chain fell from the mountain man's neck, split and smoking. The two halves of the stone now fused into one, lying between them in the mud. For a moment, time itself seemed to stop. The storm's fury faded to a whisper, and even the wind quieted as if waiting. The Apache looked down at the stone, then back up at the man before him. There was no hate in his eyes now, only understanding. "You can't fight what's already done," he said softly. The mountain man lowered his rifle, his breath heavy, his shoulders shaking under the weight of something that had nothing to do with the rain. "My father told me your kind were savages," he said, his voice low, almost broken. "He said the land was meant for us." The Apache nodded once. "And what did it give you? This land, this mountain?" The man's gaze dropped to the shattered pendant. "Nothing," he whispered. "It took everything." For the first time, he saw not a stranger, but the truth his father had buried. The mountain had never belonged to anyone. It only tolerated them both. The rain washed down his face, mingling with the tears he didn't hide this time. The woman came forward, her steps slow and cautious, the mud clinging to her dress. She knelt between them, picking up the joined pendant with trembling fingers. It was warm to the touch, almost alive. "It's whole again," she said softly. Maybe that's what it wanted. Neither man spoke for a while. The Apache looked toward the horizon where the first pale light of dawn broke through the clouds. The storm had passed, leaving the world quiet and raw. The mountain man stared at the ground, his eyes heavy with guilt. "You should go," the Apache finally said, turning away. "The land will not take another life today." The mountain man didn't argue. He turned back toward the trail, shoulders slumped, and disappeared into the mist without another word. The sound of his boots faded, leaving only the wind and the soft rush of water from the cliffs. The woman stood beside the Apache, holding the pendant in her palm. "What will you do now?" she asked. He looked at the sky, where the clouds were breaking apart into silver. "I will bury it where it began," he said, "so it can rest." She hesitated, her voice softer now. "And you?" He glanced at her, and for the first time, a faint smile touched his lips. "I will walk until I find peace. Maybe the mountain will forgive me for staying this long." They began to walk together down the slope, their footsteps quiet in the wet grass. The air smelled of rain and pine, clean and new. Every few moments she glanced at him, wondering if she would ever see him again after this day. When they reached the valley floor, the town below was still and half hidden in mist. Smoke rose from the chimneys, and people began to stir, unaware of the storm that had just passed through their lives. The Apache stopped at the edge of the clearing. "This is where we part," he said. She turned to him, the pendant still in her hand. "You could come back with me," she offered. "They don't all hate your people. Some would understand." He shook his head gently. "The land remembers. It's not ready to forgive them yet. And neither am I." She looked down at the stone, then pressed it into his palm. "Then take it," she said. "It belongs to you." He closed his fingers around it, the weight of it grounding him. "It belongs to both," he said. "One half from each world. Maybe one day they'll remember that." The woman felt tears rise in her eyes, though she didn't understand why. There was something sacred in his words, something bigger than either of them. "Will I ever see you again?" she asked quietly. He looked toward the ridges where the sun was beginning to rise, casting gold over the wet trees. "If the wind ever carries my name, listen," he said. "That will be enough." Then he turned and walked into the forest, his figure fading into the morning mist until he became part of the mountain against island, unbroken, eternal. The woman stood there for a long time, watching until the last trace of him vanished. When she finally walked back to town, the world seemed different. The people looked smaller, the buildings weaker. Everything that had once felt ordinary now felt fragile, as though the earth beneath it all could swallow it if it chose. When she entered the saloon, the piano was quiet. The same men who had shouted for blood the night before now sat still, avoiding her eyes. The sheriff met her at the door, his hat in his hands. "He's gone?" he asked softly. She nodded. "Both of them are," sighed, glancing out toward the hills. "Maybe that's for the best." She looked past him, through the dusty windows toward the mountains still draped in fog. "No," she said quietly. "It's not over. The land remembers." For days afterward, the townsfolk spoke of strange sounds in the canyons at night, low echoes that rolled like voices in the wind. Some said it was just the storm's memory fading away. Others swore they saw a figure walking the ridge at sunset, tall and still, the glint of turquoise catching the light. The mountain man was never seen again. Some believed he left for the northern mines, others that he wandered too far and never came back. But the woman knew better. The mountain had taken what it was owed. Seasons passed, and the town grew quieter, the saloon emptier. The woman stayed, running the place with a kind of calm strength that made the men speak softer when she passed. Every evening, when the sky turned red behind the peaks, she would step outside and look toward the horizon. She never said a word, but sometimes she thought she heard something carried on the wind, a faint whisper, like a promise never broken. Years later, when strangers came through the valley and asked about the storm that changed the town, old folks would tell them stories. They spoke of the Apache king, who walked down from the mountain, and the woman who faced the darkness beside him. They said the mountains still watched over her, and on nights when the thunder rolled, you could see two lights burning on the ridge, one gold, one blue, standing side by side, and though the years faded their names into dust, the land kept their memory. The mountain that had once divided them became their witness. It stood silent, unchanging, a reminder that even the deepest scars could one day heal if the world remembered what it had taken. The woman's life grew long and quiet, but every time the rain fell, she would close her eyes and listen to it, because somewhere in its sound She could still hear his voice saying the same words that ended that storm. The ones that stayed with her until her last breath. The land remembers. It always does.